Our next guests are both reporters for NBC News and are also the hosts of the hit #1 podcast, South Lake. Please welcome Mike Hixenbaugh and Antonia Hylton to the South by Southwest studio.
Thank you so much for having us. We're happy to be here.
You guys just finished your panel?
We did.
Did it go well?
It went so well.
Amazing.
It was really like, what an amazing community that we have here to be in conversation with.
So I want to talk about the South Lake podcast. Why do you think it struck such a chord with audiences?
You know, when we started reporting on this, we thought we were reporting on one town's fight over how to talk about racism in schools. And as we were reporting it, we started to realize this wasn't isolated, that this, as we wrote our initial stories on South Lake, our inboxes, our emails filled up with messages from people all over the country saying, this fight over racism and how to talk about it is happening everywhere. And this was before all of America learned the phrase critical race theory. It was before school boards were filling up with parents yelling and shouting. And we realized early on that, oh, this will resonate. And so that's why we told it in the form of a podcast, because the audio, you know, could connect with people and make the story relevant and real to them. And so I think that's why people all over the country hear the podcast and they tell us, I live in South Lake. I live in the South Lake of Akron, Ohio. I live in the South Lake of, you know, the
St. Louis, Missouri.
Exactly, right. Yep. And so it's connecting with everyone.
What are some of the most troubling things that you've uncovered?
Well, a dynamic that I think we found pretty early on in our reporting was a sense that many children felt silenced, felt ignored, or even worse, actively disrespected or included from their educational communities. And so we made it a mission of ours to make sure that students' voices were going to be at the forefront of this podcast, that not that we just interviewed them and let them say their piece, but we bring you into the hallways with them. You'd actually feel what school was like for some of these kids. And, you know, as Mike said, it was this political movement that grew while our reporting was growing at the very same time. And so I think it's so important in an instance like that is to cut through some of the noise, adults or politicians fighting about this or that, and to show people this is what's actually happening in classrooms right now. Here are some of the kids, their names, their experiences, their families. And we really brought you into their living rooms, sports teams, their dances they went to together, and really gave you a sense of place. And I think that part of the reason it ended up being so successful is that people just were not doing that when it came to this story, this reporting. And kids' voices were missing from the debate, and they deserved to be there. And so, you know, that was just a huge part of our emphasis and our focus. And I think that putting kids at the center of the story really paid off.
I mean, they're the real stakeholders. They're the ones that are dealing with this. I mean, all the yelling that happens when they're not there almost seems ridiculous that they're not included in that conversation.
Yeah, well, and when you listen to the podcast, I think the moments that connect and stick with people are the moments when some of the kids who are living in these school systems in the Carroll district, who have been calling for changes to make them feel welcome there in this district that is majority white, predominantly conservative, but growing more diverse. And so when you hear audio that a queer student has reported in the principal's office, where she's trying to tell the principal that these boys have been harassing me on social media and mocking my gender identity, calling me slurs. And you can hear the principal response being, I think they were just trying to debate. They're into politics, they're just trying to debate. Maybe they use some poor language. And you can hear the student crying. And so we took people, you know, when there's all this conversation around how should schools be discussing LGBTQ issues? Should they even be talking about it? How do you address historical racism or systemic racism that exists today? And the answer you hear at school board meetings is, this isn't an issue that needs to be addressed. In reality, when you play the audio that we play in our podcast, you can't really reach that conclusion. The debate isn't should we or shouldn't we address this, it's how are you going to address this?
So I should take a step back for people who haven't heard the South Lake podcast yet. Could you just give me an overview of what it's all about?
They should go listen.
They should it is available everywhere where you can, I'm just kidding, but not really. South Lake is a limited series podcast in which we dive really deeply into one Texas town that was really ground zero, one of the earliest towns where this fight over diversity, equity, and inclusion, how to talk about race and history in schools really got its start. This town was having this fight before the phrase critical race theory really entered the national consciousness. And so in the series, we're able to take you back in time, actually several years. Again, before these buzzwords were there, before we started seeing parents shouting at each other at school board meetings, and really bring you into a town, a suburban town that is like many towns around the United States, and use Southlake to tell a very American story about the changing face of the country, about the impact of diversity, and diversity meaning racial diversity, cultural, sexual diversity, and introduce you to real people, the stakeholders who are living this, and take the story from its real start to finish. And I think that is, while that sounds very simple, to transport you to a place, to introduce you to the right people, it's actually something that can be quite hard to do in journalism. It's a project that required many months of our time, lots of trips and time in Southlake, a huge investment in building trust, because to get kids and parents to talk about traumatic experiences, challenges in education, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
It does not sound easy, especially since you're having uncomfortable conversations they're really prevalent right now. I think it's something that everybody's talking about, especially here.
Absolutely.
South by Southwest. What have been some of your top responses from listeners? How is it being accepted?
Wow. We have been overwhelmed with messages from people all over the country, again, saying, this is happening here. Come write about our school district. And we've done that in some cases. And I think the most emotional responses we get are from students who tell us, I heard my own voice in that principal's office, trying to get my story out. This happened to me. Thank you for making me feel not alone. And I think that is, very validating, that this is an important story and we should tell more like it.
I can hear the compassion in your voice when you say that, and I feel that.
I'm a dad, I have kids, so it's like can you imagine having your kid go off to school? They're there more than they're at home, and to find out that it's not a safe spot for them, they don't feel welcome there. And so school districts trying to address that, whether or not you agree with their approach, it seems like we should all be invested in figuring out how to deal with that so that everyone can go to school and feel okay there.
It's also helped, I think, adults reflect as well, though. I mean, we heard from people who grew up in that town, a decade or more ago, and it brought back a flood of memories for them too. And it's actually caused us to have some really interesting conversations about our upbringing, the successes and failures of the schools that we went to, and it's brought up our own memories of what it was like to be a teenager and learning about the world, often in communities that didn't entirely reflect what the full world looked like. And so we learned so much just from working with each other and from getting to tell the story, and learned a lot from the kids in this community who are, on the front lines of it all right now.
I mean, that's how it works. When you're delving deep into these stories, you learn just as much as you're teaching.
Absolutely.
So what about Southlake itself, like the community leaders? What's been their reaction to this?
Well, it depends. In terms of people who are in elected office, this is a community that, 2/3 of voters voted for Donald Trump, that the movement against critical race theory is very much aligned with the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And so a lot of the feedback from city leaders, school board members who were recently elected has been pretty negative. I have a nickname in Southlake amongst some, Mike Hixenbaugh, which is pretty clever.
What is it?
My last name's Hixenbaugh. They call me Hixenbaugh because I'm not writing truth stories. I kind of think that's hilarious. So
I've been trying to get T-shirts printed.
I mean,
I'll update you when they're available.
That's not that bad. I've heard worse.
But community leaders aren't the only ones who are responding, and we're hearing from kids and parents and alumni who are saying thank you. Thank you for bringing this story forward. Our goal was not to malign the town, to create this image that this town's just racist and everyone there is racist. We've never said that. We've never reported that. We've just put microphones in front of people who live there, who went to the schools and had them talk, and we've put opportunities for everyone in the community regardless of what perspective you have, to come sit and talk with us to help us understand. Unfortunately, a certain segment of the community has just not been interested in that. They a lot of distrust of media, other than Fox News or the Federalist, and it took a lot of effort to still reflect their voices in the podcast, and we were committed to that. We went through hours of audio from school board meetings and made sure that those parents' perspectives and voices were fully included, and reached out to them repeatedly to ask them, come sit down with us, can we come to your home, can we meet your family and understand what your concerns are.
The due diligence of a true journalist.
Right. So it is frustrating on the back end of that to be accused of only caring about one side of the story. It's a little bit of a self-fulfilling thing that happens. Is on the front end, you're reaching out, please talk with us. And then you do the final story and it's like, well,
you didn't listen.
Exactly, they didn't talk to us. And it's like, well, you wouldn't let us. It's frustrating, but it's part of being a journalist now.
It is.
So why are most communities so bad at talking about race still? What advice do you have for communities who wish to address racism? And do you have any ideas on how they can open minds to the conversation?
Well, to the first part of your question, I think there are a lot of people in the United States who want that to stop being a conversation. For whatever reason, it makes them uncomfortable. It raises, realities or criticisms of the community in which they live that they don't want to address. And so they'd rather shut the conversation down than come to the table and figure out a path forward. I saw that in the town in which I grew up, where people believed, that they lived in a suburb outside of Boston and this is not an issue anymore. And, we're all here at this nice school system. What's really the issue? And I think the problem is that, what you do in that scenario is you make a certain segment of your community, whether it's, Black or Asian or Latino families, or it's families that have queer students who are going to the school district, it sends them sort of
Excuse me.
It sends some of those families a message that their voices don't matter, or that their concerns shouldn't really be reflected back in the communal conversation. And so I think that's why you see it not go away, because they refuse to be told that they don't matter. So they keep coming forward and asking to be heard. And I think people ask us all the time, have you seen any good solutions? Or are you seeing someone really tackle this problem after finishing this project? What I tell them is that you need to listen to kids, because they are often the most civil and kind when they disagree with each other. They have a lot of ideas and solutions. They have a lot of thoughts about what they'd like to learn and talk about in school. So if you just ask them, they might have some good solutions too. That would be my recommendation, is to actually talk to the kids who live around you and don't assume that you know what's best for them all the time. And that might be a path forward. But
no, I like that.
We're waiting for the chance to cover that part of the story, because we are in a tough moment, I think, where people are fighting back and forth and only listening to the side they like to listen to. And it makes solutions hard to come by.
So we've seen numerous videos of students using racist slurs in communities across the country. What made you feel this community deserved the in-depth exploration?
Their issue, the viral video in Southlake was released in 2018, so years before we became involved in this. And what got us involved was in the summer of 2020 and heading into that fall, I was working on a story looking at just tension in the suburbs heading into the 2020 presidential election. At a time when Donald Trump was saying that Democrats are coming and Black Lives Matter is coming to destroy suburbia. I was seeing in the suburb where I lived at the time outside of Houston, that message pitting neighbors against each other. Mm-hmm. And so I was on a phone call with the then Texas GOP chairman, Allen West, asking him, is that message resonating? They're coming for the suburbs? And he told me, yeah, and here's an example. The folks in Southlake, Texas. And I wasn't aware of the conflict there, but when we looked into it, we found that what was happening there reflected this broader national conflict that was really emerging in 2020 in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests and heading into the election. And so that's where it started. I don't think we realized heading into it that it would become we didn't have that plan to invest like this at the beginning. It's that we wrote an initial story and did an initial TV piece on the fight in Southlake in January of 2021 and in February, and the response we got nationally, that's when we heard from people all over the place saying, this is happening here, they're coming to school boards. This national fight had been transposed onto these local school boards. And so at that point, we put together a plan to do this podcast, to go even more in depth in Southlake, because we knew that it would resonate beyond Southlake.
So making it relatable by telling the one story.
Go deep in
what
one
it
place.
really is,
Yeah.
the whole story. It just makes you understand.
There's a line in there from one of the most vocal opponents to the diversity plan in town. He has his own podcast, and on it, he at one point said, "So goes Southlake, so goes America." And his message was like a warning that if you let critical race theory in here, Marxism will spread across America. But I think he was right in terms of like what's happening here is the American story.
So Antonia, you attended schools with mostly white populations. How did you handle instances of racism, ignorance? How did you talk about race with your white classmates?
Well, frankly, honestly, a lot of the time I handled it by coming home and talking to my family. Me and my siblings were some of the only black kids in the school system, and so they were often the only people I could ask about, what do I do if somebody said this to me? My parents were the only people I could trust or run to when I needed to know how to respond. And so I often, frankly, didn't have the tools. There wasn't a ton of training. There wasn't an easy person or an obvious educator for me to go to when those issues came up. Later on, when I was in high school, I had a history teacher named Miss Hahn, and she became that person, and so I leaned on her all the time. But it was hard to find that person. I didn't find them until I was halfway through high school. So I grew up basically my entire life in this one community, and it took well over a decade to find an advocate, someone who had my back. So, my advice to people when they reach out to us and tell us their stories is often to try to find that person, because I didn't even know for a while that I needed it. I think when I actually talked about race with my classmates, the best thing I could do was tell them my story, my family's history. And I think often when, I come from a family of a father who is a descendant of Black American slaves and a mother who's a descendant of Black Cuban slaves. And so I could talk to them about this history with not just a deep American perspective, but a global perspective. And so often I just told them about my family members, the things that they fought for in this country, the experience my mom and dad had growing up in cities that had intense racial challenges like Baltimore and Detroit. And, some people heard and I think were changed by some of those stories and some didn't. But I think part of the reason I ended up being a reporter is because I really valued just the power of storytelling, the power of history, of connecting history to our present. And that's something that always carried with me. And I was so grateful to have a team of people on the Southlake podcast who had a very similar mindset, that in order to tell the story of Southlake, we couldn't just put those microphones in faces and just record what's happening right now. We needed to go back in time a little bit to set the scene so people really understand what Southlake is like and why Southlake is very similar to many similar communities all around the country. And I think going back in time really helps you understand the present. And it's a central part of, honestly, when we're talking about race and history, that tension between how you move forward, do you have to recognize the past first? That's a big piece of it. And so
it's a heavy burden for a little kid to have to be the representation for a whole school to talk about race.
And I am, I'm one of 7 kids, so it wasn't just me. but yeah, it was hard. It was hard. And when you talk to kids, it's still hard.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Sometimes some of the pain of actually working on this project was talking to kids who were experiencing things in school that I experienced and just feeling sad that, why I'm so long out of high school, why are they still going through that? Mm-hmm. But there's a sense of community, there's a sense of support that you get out of hearing those stories too, so it kind of goes both ways. But it is a lot to put on kids.
Hey, Mike, you got 4 kids, right?
I do.
How do you talk to them about race issues?
Well, my kids are ages 3 and the oldest is 11, so that's the range. But we've been very intentional about discussing race with them very early, in part because their mom is Black biracial, their grandpa is on her side Black, And so they see differences. And so our approach has just been to address it in an age-appropriate way. But I think that's what's interesting is we've heard over and over again, stop shoving these conversations onto our kids about race from mostly white folks. And, you know, parents of black children don't really get to decide that because the conversation comes to them. And so they can either react to it or address it proactively. And so we try to be honest and present them with content and books and that, you know, frankly, some parents don't want in their kids' elementary school classrooms.
At least lately.
Yeah. And, you know, I think to not hide it because the idea that we could just pretend that race no longer is an issue and that we're all colorblind, I mean, it sounds magical.
But it's not real.
It just hasn't been the reality from my wife's lived experience. And yeah, it wouldn't be the truth.
Okay, so what's next for Southlake? What do you got? Where are you taking it?
Oh boy.
I think
Where are you taking it?
Well, we're going to continue covering these stories at the intersection of politics and education. Both of us love podcasting, so when the right story is there to dive back in, I think we're going to tell it. Yeah. But that was a big project, and in some ways it feels like Southlake isn't over. I mean, we just released a new bonus episode the other day, and so the story's still there. We're committed to continuing covering it, but that could come in so many forms, from written pieces to TV to podcasting. I mean, yeah.
How do you think what we saw there in Southlake, how do you think that's going to play out in the midterms?
Well, I think we can see it already going to be like people are running on the platform of stopping critical race theory. All of these bills have been introduced in state legislatures across the country. Glenn Youngkin in Virginia very much leaned into the issue. And now we're seeing an increased emphasis on LGBTQ rights and a kind of a blowback and pushback to even addressing those issues in schools, kind of that becoming the new focus of the movement. So I think that is where the story is heading, not just in terms of the midterms or the presidential race, but in communities is this going to be a place where it's okay to talk about and to be different and to identify as LGBTQ, or is that something that we're going to suppress through legislation or local school policy? And I think that is heating up as the new major issue.
I'm very glad that we have journalists like you out there doing the hard work and making the uncomfortable conversations happen. And the fact that you are well balanced is very important. So thank you, and thank you for coming into the studio today. It was really lovely to talk to you guys.
So lovely to meet you. Thank you for having us.
So thanks, Antonia and Mike, and thank you all for being here today. It's been great hanging out with you. So you can see the complete interview schedule at southbysouthwestedu.com/studio, and you can find all of our studio interviews on the South by Southwest EDU app, available on Apple TV, Roku, Android TV, and of course, Amazon Fire. Thanks, guys.